Hi, Mystery Recapped here. Today, I'm going to explain a sci-fi action movie called The Tomorrow War. Spoilers ahead. Watch out and take care. The movie opens up in December 2022 as a man named Dan Foster is giving a phone interview for the post of a lab researcher. He hopes that his military record as a Green Beret and his current job as a biology teacher will help him get hired. He then enters his home where they have a Christmas party and calls for his daughter Muri to help him carry the groceries. Following this, Dan walks out to finish the call, but learns that someone else has got the job. Probably John Krasinski, that bastard. This disappoints him greatly, but he goes inside to watch the Qatar World Cup on TV alongside his daughter. The two then have a heart-to-heart chat about Muri's future, but something strange happens on the telly. The game is suddenly interrupted when a glowing cloud of smoke and electricity appears on the field, and several armed soldiers start coming out of it. They are led by a woman named Lieutenant Hart, who informs everyone that they came from the year 2051. Apparently, an alien species known as the White Spikes has invaded Earth, and most of humanity has been wiped out. These soldiers are here to ask for people to travel to the future with them and help fight the war. In the next 12 months, nations all over the world send as many soldiers as they can. The authorities in the future keep asking for more people, and only a quarter of these soldiers come back alive. When they run out of trained soldiers, the governments begin drafting civilians to join the fight. One day, Dan is holding a biology class when he notices that no one seems to be listening. He stops teaching and asks the students what topic they want to talk about. Only one student, named Martin, who is obsessed with volcanoes, raises his hand. This conversation, however, is interrupted when Dan gets a message on his phone informing him that he has been drafted to the war. Later, he goes to his nearest military office to confirm the news. Dan is informed that he's going to die in 7 years, which is why he meets the requirements for conscription. A shocked Dan bombards them with a lot of questions, but the officers only give vague answers. They don't listen to what he is saying and attach a device to his arm. Then, he is told that the device tracks him and will assist him in the future war. It also can't be removed until he comes back from 2051. That evening, Dan meets his wife Emmy and tells her everything that has happened. She becomes distraught and says they should run away from the government, but Dan points out that the device on his arm tracks his every movement, so the authorities will find them no matter where they go. They can travel through time, honey. They will catch us. With no other option left, Emmy suggests Dan visit his estranged father, James. The old man is a skilled engineer and will not alert the authorities, as he deeply distrusts the government. It is then revealed that Dan's father left the family after returning from Vietnam, as he was unable to cope with the trauma and violence he experienced. This abandonment left a deep scar on Dan and led to resentment towards his father. A couple of hours later, Dan reluctantly meets his father in an aircraft hangar. However, their conversation quickly turns sour, and the two men end up arguing with one another. An enraged Dan then walks out, instructing his father never to send letters to Muri again. Now, Dan has no options but to get enlisted for the war. He goes home and finds his daughter playing in the backyard. He tries to lie, explaining that he's going on a trip, but she immediately understands that he's been drafted. Dan then promises her that he will come back and gives her a hug before leaving. A day later, he and the other rookies are trained in weaponry and first aid to have better chances of staying alive. Dan meets an environment scientist, Charlie, and an ex-Navy SEAL, Dorian. While most people want to avoid getting drafted, this will be Dorian's third time in the war. Later, they are informed that the White Spikes they are fighting all disappear every 6 days to rest. This is when the newly recruited soldiers are sent to the future. Similarly, the soldiers who have completed their duty are also returned back to their own timeline during the 6 days, when the White Spikes hibernate. That evening, when the new recruits are talking, an alarm suddenly goes off. The young soldiers from 2051 scream that it's not a drill, and people hastily run towards the portal room. Dan asks Lieutenant Hart what's happening, and she gives him a grave answer. Apparently, the last research facility in 2051 is being attacked, and if they lose it, the entire war will be lost. A few minutes later, they enter the portal room where the gateway to the future is powering up. People start being sucked into the portal, but suddenly, an error occurs with the coordinates of the landing location. This results in Dan and the others teleporting high up in the sky, and most of them fall to their deaths. Fortunately, Chris Pratt has played Garfield, so he can survive long falls. Dan, Charlie, and Dorian land in a swimming pool on top of a skyscraper. Dan quickly gets out of the water and checks his gun. He then goes to the edge of the roof to observe the city of Miami Miami, which is now in ruins. While the military investigates what went wrong in the time jump, Chief Command contacts the survivors. Dan responds, and they explain that they are going to bomb the area since there are too many white spikes around. Also, Dan will have to lead a combat search and rescue operation to save some stranded scientists in a nearby building that is surrounded by white spikes. He confirms the mission and immediately regroups all the survivors on the roof. Soon afterwards, the group gets to the building where the scientists are supposed to be. They enter it cautiously, and Chief Command urges them to be careful, as white spikes can smell blood from a mile away. Unfortunately, they soon spot the team of scientists, all of whom are already dead. Chief Command then tasks the soldiers with retrieving hard drives and biosamples from the lab. However, as Dan finds the vials of the samples, he is notified that fighter aircrafts are being deployed to bomb the area in 6 minutes. Dan and his team quickly get out of the building and reach the emergency stairway, but just then, several white spikes appear from above and start attacking them. Dan tries to fend one off by himself, but eventually gets help from Dorian, who points out that these creatures can only be killed through the weak spot in their neck or belly. Why wasn't he briefed about this before he jumped through time? While the airstrike is 3 minutes out, Chief Command sends rescue vehicles to pick the team up. The soldiers breathe a sigh of relief to see the military jeeps and think they're safe for the time being, but suddenly, 3 white spikes rush to the scene and totally devastate the vehicles. Several team members are killed in action as they attempt to flee while defending themselves. Seconds later, the airstrike commences, and the team that is now down to 7 tries their best to escape the bombing zone. 2 soldiers even sacrifice themselves to delay the white spikes. This finally allows the remaining 5 to make it out on time. 1 day later, Dan wakes up beside Charlie at a military base in the Caribbean. They soon meet Dorian, from whom they find out that they were the only 3 who made it. Dan then inquires about the white spike claw that Dorian has hanging around his neck. Apparently, Dorian is supposed to die of cancer in 6 months. News that he learned when he got drafted for the first time. He also tells them that the only reason he has come back several times is because he wants to die on his own terms. Dan is then summoned to speak with the head of Chief Command. To his utter shock, it is none other than the adult Colonel Murray Forrester, his daughter. She reveals that she has a PhD in biotech from MIT, making Dan extremely proud. But she adds that he was not brought to 2051 so that she could reunite with her father. The only reason he is here is so that he can help her with a critical task once the time comes. Murray refuses to tell him what that is, but insists it will be the most important event in human history. She is going to cast him as Super Mario. Following this, the duo walks into a military tent where Murray reveals that they have figured out a toxin that kills only male white spikes. She now wants Dan to help them catch a female so that they can learn how to make a toxin that kills them all. On their way to a white spike nest in a helicopter, Murray reveals that the beasts simply appeared on Earth one day. They came out of northern Russia and spread to the rest of the world, but no one ever found any vessels, crash sites, or signs of them arriving on Earth. Dan then asks her what happened to their family between 2022 and 2051. However, Murray says it is better if they do not talk about it. Moments later, they arrive at a nest where several soldiers are trying to put a cornered female white spike in a cage. Everything seems to be under control until the beast breaks free and starts attacking them. Dan, who is in the helicopter, notices a horde of male white spikes on their way to the nest. He and Murray quickly slide down and manage to put the female in a cage. However, as the helicopter takes off with the cage, the horde of male white spikes arrives at the scene. This forces the father and daughter to run to a military Humvee, and they manage to shoot their way out thanks to a heavy machine gun attached to the vehicle. After a while, they arrive at a beach and stop to catch a breather. Murray is extremely upset that Dan put himself in danger and points out that she needs him alive. She then starts revealing what happened with their family back in the 2020s. Apparently, in that timeline, Dan returned from the war in 2051 and grew disenchanted with life. He eventually divorced Emmy and left home to live like a recluse. Then, on Murray's 16th birthday, she got a call that changed her life forever. Dan had gotten in an accident. She rushed to the hospital only to see his last heartbeat on the monitor. Dan is speechless and can't believe that he turned out like his own father, someone who he resented all his life. Nonetheless, they soon reach the military base where Murray takes Dan into her lab, where she is trying to synthesize a toxin. She is geared up to test thousands of combinations in order to find a toxin that will kill the female. Murray quickly hopes that she can achieve this as soon as possible, because there are only 21 hours left before Dan is sent back to his own timeline. The following morning, Dan comes back to the lab and asks Murray how she plans to deploy the toxin. She finally explains that the military in 2051 is running out of resources. This is why she needs Dan to take the toxin back to his time and mass produce it. That way, they will stop the war from ever occurring in the first place. While the two are having this this conversation, the computer tells them that the current test is a 100% bond, meaning they have found the toxin. Unfortunately, the captured female white spike suddenly awakens and makes a loud call. The entire base is breached by white spikes in no time, and Dan and Miri grab guns to make a run for the helicopter pad. They soon get cornered by several monsters and have to shoot their way out. Dan tries mind controlling them with the palms of his hands, but it doesn't work this time. Simultaneously, an automated voice tells them through the facility's speakers that there are 3 minutes left until time jumpers have to be sent back. An anxious Miri then hands Dan the vial with the toxin, but before they can escape, a white spike appears. Just as it is about to attack, the floor underneath gives way due to their weight. The white spike and Miri then start sliding towards the edge. A desperate Dan leaps after his daughter, but is teleported back in the middle of his jump. He wakes up in 2022, holding the vial containing the toxin firmly in his hand. Sometime later, he tells Lieutenant Hart that they must mass produce the toxin and send it back in time. However, she informs him that the time portal's been destroyed from the other end, and no one can travel to the future. With nothing else to do, Dan heads home and immediately embraces his little daughter. That night, he explains to Emmy that he met Miri in the future and that they made a toxin together.
She's so good at making toxins, honey. It's crazy.
He also tells her that no one knew where the white spikes came from, as they suddenly showed up in the year 2048, when his wife suggests those creatures could have landed from space years earlier. A light bulb goes off in Dan's head. The scene abruptly shifts to a bar where Dan is having a conversation with Dorian. The two discuss the events from the future and agree on finding a solution to stop the war from ever happening. They take the white spike claw that Dorian has around his neck and go to see Charlie. The latter, being an expert in environmental science, analyzes the claw and sees it has volcanic ash on it from China. This bewilders them, as the white spikes first appeared from northern Russia and not China. First COVID, now this? Shortly afterwards, the trio ends up in Dan's biology classroom, where they ask Martin how a creature from Russia can end up having ash from China under its claws. Martin, who is obsessed with volcanoes, explains the ash has to be from the Changbai mountain eruption from 1,000 years ago. It took place in northern China and was so big that the ash can still be found deep inside the icebergs in northern Russia. Upon hearing this, it finally dawns on the group that the white spikes arrived a millennium ago and became frozen deep inside the ice. Through a simulation, they quickly conclude that the ice sheets in Russia will melt by 2048, the exact year when the white spikes will attack. After their discovery, they ask the US Air Force to fund a covert mission into Russia. The government refuses this idea, as the relationship between the US and Russia is already very bad. What about the relationship between the US and the friggin' aliens, you dumbass? So instead, Dan goes to his father James, who has a collection of unregistered aeroplanes, to fly them to Russia. The latter immediately agrees, and Lieutenant Hart joins with a batch of newly produced toxins. After several hours, they arrive at the Academy of Glacier Sciences in northern Russia. They immediately begin looking around the area for signs of anything strange. The team soon comes across a location where the electronic devices stop functioning thanks to a weird magnetic field surrounding the area. Using lots of explosives, they open a hole in the ground, which seems to be the entrance to an ancient cavern. The team cautiously enters and manages to find a frozen alien spaceship. "I've seen this before," says Star-Lord. They then cut through the ice using a chainsaw and enter the ship. Charlie and James are left outside in case something tries to escape. Sometime later, the group reaches the cockpit and realizes this is a crash site. Turns out the aliens never intended Earth to be their destination. They go into another room and find the actual white spikes inside a series of biopods, which makes them realize they're cargo. These creatures were bioengineered by some alien race as weapons to colonize other planets. Nonetheless, the team quickly begins injecting the pods with the toxin and watches the white spikes wriggling in pain, confirming their cure actually works. However, their cries also wake up the aliens that haven't been injected yet, causing them to break their pods and attack. The team shoots as many as they can, but some of them manage to escape. At this critical moment, Dorian says that they have no choice but to blow up the entire ship. Why didn't they start with that? He gives Dan his claw and decides to stay behind to activate the bomb once everyone is out. Unfortunately, the team is attacked on their way out of the ship, and only Dan, Charlie, and James manage to escape before the bomb is activated. Every creature inside the ship is now dead except one huge, red-bellied specimen. Dan realizes that it is the female, which is a problem because some sick human will procreate with that thing. So they split up to go after her. In a brilliant brilliant stroke of genius, Dan makes a snowman and covers it with a jacket to make it look like a human. The Queen White Spike soon falls for this trap and descends downwards. Nearby, Dan and James are waiting with their sniper rifles for the right chance to attack. The Queen lands, and they open fire and keep shooting until they manage to push it off the edge of the cliff. Unfortunately, the formidable beast returns and attacks in such a way that the father and son are forced to separate. It shoots a spike at Dan from a distance and lunges at him. However, our hero uses that same spike to stab the Queen's mouth, while James plants an axe in her eyes. The Queen is now blind and begins thrashing around in desperation. Dan takes this opportunity to inject the toxin into her leg, but to his utter horror, the Queen White Spike is intelligent enough to amputate her own leg before the toxin can spread. At this crucial moment, James raises his wounded hand to make the aliens smell his blood and come after him, but Dan refuses to let his father die and jumps on the Queen. He slices her neck with Dorian's claw and inserts the last vial of toxin in her mouth before kicking her down the cliff again. This causes the Queen to crash against a big rock and finally die. The next day, newscasts all over the world report an explosion in Russia that killed a bunch of aliens. The government tries to take credit for the whole operation. In the meantime, Dan returns home and reunites with his family. He also puts all the resentment aside and embraces his father. Subscribe for more videos like this, turn on notifications, and leave a like to help the channel out. Thank you for watching.